Welcome, listeners, to Snippit Sports Science Podcast, sponsored by EliteForm.com. This is Jared Coleman-Starr, today with Chris Gavilia. How are you doing, Chris?
Good, thanks, Jared. How yourself, mate?
Pretty well, thank you. Today we are doing an article by Jon Schoenfeld and Alan Aragon, two titans of hypertrophy and nutrition, on their viewpoint for, is there a post-workout anabolic window of opportunity for nutrient consumption? Clearing up controversies.
Yeah, and I really like this article because I remember as a mere 88 kilo potential wannabe thrower who eventually got to 131 kilos. It was really big when I was growing up about that window of opportunity. I think we've all heard about it. You know, if you got to make sure you take advantage of that window. So I was really big on it. And I think, anyway, trying to get to 131 kilos, you're creating more windows. You're punching windows with big, massive sledgehammers because you've got to get big. But anyway, so this, I think when both of us put this article up, it drew me to it because it's quite nice to understand facts or fallacies.
So nutrient timing has been a popular strategy for enhancing muscular adaptations and athletic performance for a long time now. From the standpoint of muscle hypertrophy, the concept of a post-workout anabolic window of opportunity has been proposed, whereby a limited time exists after training to optimize accretion of muscle protein, generally believed to be less than an hour after completion of an exercise bout. According to nutrient timing theory, ingesting the proper nutrients during this time frame promotes an additive anabolic response to the exercise bout that maximizes hypertrophic adaptations. Delaying protein intake by a matter of minutes after this period is suspected to compromise muscular gains. Some researchers have gone so far as to claim that the timing of nutritional consumption is even more critical to muscle development than the absolute daily consumption of nutrients. Thus, the purpose of this paper is to review the current literature as to the relevance of the anabolic window of opportunity and draw evidence-based conclusions for application into practice.
Quick question there, Jared. When it said a delayed protein intake by a matter of minutes, were you thinking the body goes, 61 minutes, you're stuffed?
Absolutely. It's like you'll lose muscle mass.
Yeah, well, and then is it by the time that you've finished your last main set or by the time you walked out of the gym? Where's your 60 minutes?
That's true. Does it count the cool down? It's pretty, you really got to get on top of it there.
Yeah. Anyway, that was the thought that actually went through my head. Irrespective, so the concept of the nutrient.
You know what I actually think about when I hear about this, like, stress-induced anxiety from bodybuilders, you know, trying to get their protein out. What I think of is the amount of cortisol that you pump into yourself over a completely unnecessary stress is going to be more catabolic than not having the protein. That's ridiculous to me.
Yeah, that's a very good point there.
So where did this concept originate, Chris?
Yeah, it was based on the short-term studies showing that there was actually superior increases in muscle protein synthesis when amino acids were consumed in the immediate post-workout period versus delaying ingestion. This early work was actually done in canines, which demonstrated that the immediate effusion of an amino acid and glucose solution following 150 minutes of treadmill running significantly increased muscle protein synthesis compared to infusion 2 hours post-exercise. Another study found similar results in human participants with either early, so that's immediately after 60 minutes of moderate intensity cycling, or later 3 hours post-exercise consumption of a supplement containing 10 grams of protein, 8 grams of carbs, and 3 grams of fat. Whereas the muscle protein synthesis spiked threefold in the early condition, the response was actually halted or attenuated to only 12% with late provision. Although these findings suggest that the timing of protein ingestion after workout is critical to maximize this muscle protein synthesis, it should be noted that these studies involved long-duration cardio-based exercise. And given the aerobic nature of the exercise bout, it could be speculated that the increased protein synthetic rate from the immediate provision was actually due to greater mitochondrial or possibly sarcoplasmic fractions as opposed to the contractile elements.
Right, and actually there's so many other proteins that you could be building after exercise as well. It's a whole body stimulus.
Yeah, and once again, we always go on about this, about what's the study like. They're doing long duration cardiorespiratory exercise, and particularly we're looking about this anabolic window more around resistance training.
Right. I've never known an endurance athlete that was too worried about their protein intake. It's typically people concerned about muscle mass.
Maybe they should.
Anyway, in contrast to studies employing aerobic exercise, acute resistance training studies have shown mixed results as to the effects of post-workout nutrient timing on the muscle protein synthesis response. Rasmussen and colleagues randomized participants to receive a supplement containing 6 grams of essential amino acids and 35 grams of sucrose, either 1 hour or 3 hours following a high-volume bout of leg press and leg extension exercise. Muscle protein synthesis levels were elevated by approximately 400% in both conditions, indicating that timing was not a factor in the post-exercise response. Intriguingly, Tipton and colleagues found that consuming an essential amino acid carbohydrate solution pre-workout produced a significantly more pronounced elevation of muscle protein synthesis versus the immediate post-workout intake of the same supplement. These findings seemingly refute the anabolic window hypothesis. However, follow-up work from the same lab demonstrated similar increases in muscle protein synthesis when 20 grams of whey was consumed immediately prior to the resistance training bout versus 1 hour post-exercise. Further confounding matters, Fujita and colleagues reported that consumption of an essential amino acid carbohydrate supplement 1 hour prior to multi-set leg extension training did not elevate muscle protein synthesis to a greater extent than in those exercising in a fasted state. At the very least, the conflicting nature of these findings raises skepticism as to the existence of a narrow post-exercise window for protein consumption. So those were all short-term studies there. What do you think about long-term findings, Chris?
Yeah, I could start to see that, those short-term studies, there was nothing really definitive there. It's important to note that isolated measures of muscle protein synthesis do not necessarily correlate with long-term exercise-induced hypertrophy. And as with anything, it's that scrutiny between taking acute studies into a long-term study and actually having that transfer across, I think, must to be investigated a little bit more.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and they actually they've actually reviewed a couple of studies on this longer term findings, such as Esmark et al. Randomly assigned untrained older men, so these are actually 74-year-old men, to a supervised resistance training protocol where the participants consumed a combination of skim milk and soy protein, either immediately following or 2 hours after each exercise bout. Training was carried out 3 days a week for 12 weeks, longitudinal. At the end of the study, muscle cross-sectional area and mean fiber area of the quadriceps increased respectively by 7% and 22% in the group that consumed protein immediately post-workout, while the group that delayed protein ingestion did not show significant growth. On the surface, this study provides strong evidence of a benefit for early provision of a post-workout nutrient to promote muscular adaptations. However, the study had several notable limitations and inconsistencies that we must take into consideration. Firstly, the sample size had just 13 participants, 7 that received immediate protein supplement and 6 that had delayed supplementation. This compromises the ability to draw valid statistical inferences. In addition, the protein dose was a mere 10 grams, well below the estimated 40 grams needed to maximize muscle protein synthesis in older individuals. It's also highly curious that those delaying consumption by 2 hours showed no hypertrophy after 12 weeks of consistent resistance training. Considering that the significant increases in hypertrophy are routinely seen in the elderly with regimented resistance training that does not involve immediate protein supplementation, and that the immediate post-workout consumption group achieved increases in cross-sectional area similar to those experienced in such studies, we might actually have to take these results with a high degree of skepticism.
Yeah, I agree. I was quite skeptical of that study as well, particularly the relevance to us, because then we always screen these articles through the filter of proper athletes. That one I would almost completely discard, to be honest.
Yeah, and so this group actually then went and did a study of their own in their own lab. They actually conducted a meta-analysis of all randomized controlled trials where one group received protein within 1 hour post-workout and the other group delayed consumption by at least 2 hours after the completion of exercise bouts. A simple pooled analysis of a total of 23 studies showed that nutrient timing within 1 hour of workout conferred a small but statistically significant benefit to muscle hypertrophy. This finding supports the contention that the window of opportunity for maximizing muscular adaptations following an exercise bout is fairly narrow. However, Subsequent regression analysis that controlled for all covariates indicated that virtually the entire effect was explained by greater protein consumption in the nutrient-timed condition. Interesting. At issue is the fact that the majority of the studies gave a placebo, generally in the form of carbohydrate, to the participants in the control, in other words, the non-time group. This results in a discrepancy of approximately 1.7 grams per kilo versus only 1.3 grams per kilo consumed in experimental and control conditions, respectively. Given research showing that a daily protein intake of 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram is required to maximize muscular adaptations, participants who received time protein provision were necessarily at an advantage from a hypertrophy standpoint.
Yeah, that meta-analysis is really the meat of the article for me. The meta-analysis was done by Schoenfeld, Aragon, and Krieger, pretty big names there, looking at 23 studies, including 525 participants. To me, that meta-analysis is probably the greatest authority on the highest level of evidence on this topic. And so that's kind of the big conclusion for me that I take away, is that it's going to have a small beneficial effect. Definitely a benefit, but very small. And that benefit is primarily due just to the fact that you're having a higher intake of protein overall. For me personally, that's why I encourage the use of protein either before, after, during exercise, whatever, because it's a convenient time to have your protein, and it's a good
good habit to get into.
Yeah, just a good habit. It's just a good signal for you that you're like, oh, I'm going to the gym, I should have a bit of extra protein, let's get in there. And it helps you just achieve those daily protein targets. And actually, they say here that 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram to maximize muscular adaptations, but that's actually largely based on synthesis of muscle protein. And so if we're looking overall at body composition, that amount of protein intake, if you're trying to lose fat, for example, can be as high as 3 grams per kilogram per day. It can be beneficial for people trying to lose fat and thus trying to improve their overall body composition. So even then, it's just, I don't think that we should discourage anyone from having protein around exercise, because most people are protein deficient.
Yeah, and I think from a pure practical standpoint, I remember when I was going on my journey from 88 to 131 kilos, I just needed to eat. And I found that if I was doing a long 90-minute strength session, sometimes it was 120 minutes, it was quite big sessions that I was doing, I'm getting hungry. And I need to keep intensity throughout the whole session. So I need to be ensuring that I'm fueled beforehand, I'm feeling sustained throughout my session. And afterwards, mate, it's intense. Like for me, these were RPs of 9 out of 10. And I'd be finished the session, man, get some food into me. I just need to eat. I'm ravenous.
Absolutely. Yeah, food is king at the end of the day. And yeah, personally, I get that hunger massively as well, especially if it's anything like swimming, as well. You got that kind of cooling effect from the water that you're also creating that body heat. And swimming would just make me absolutely ravenous. So in fact, actually, maybe the only thing is if you're trying to lose weight, a protein shake after exercise could actually help you stave off that hunger from training. And so it could play almost more of a role in fat loss rather than muscle gain. Again.
Good point. And the article actually just goes on how this group actually then went and did extra studies to actually fill in these recent gaps that they actually found in literature. Do you want to just expand on that, Jared?
Yeah, that's an excellent approach. So you do a meta-analysis, figure out what research is out there, and then fill in those gaps that you find. So what their laboratory, that Schoenfeld and colleagues did, was they compared pre-exercise versus post-exercise nutrient timing in resistance-trained men, because all these studies didn't actually use resistance-trained men previously. So their participants were randomized to receive a supplement containing 25 grams of whey protein, either immediately before or immediately after total body resistance training. The group receiving protein immediately before exercise was instructed to refrain from eating for at least 3 hours after training to ensure that post-exercise nutrition did not confound results. Similarly, the group receiving protein immediately after exercise was instructed to refrain from eating for at least 3 hours prior to training in order to avoid confounding from pre-exercise nutrition. The results showed no differences in measures of hypertrophy between the groups over the 10-week study period. These findings indicate that any benefits of immediate post-workout nutrition are nullified when protein is consumed prior to the exercise bout.
What was the first thing you would have think I would have thought of when I thought 3 hours?
How hungry you'd be.
I read that and I went, no way I could do that. 3 hours
Yeah.
before or 3 hours after? Man,
Well,
that's tough.
you know what the other thing for me is with the protein shake is it's also just a good signal to rehydrate as well. Because if anyone you know is filling up a protein shake and then bang down 250, 500 mils, whatever it is of water with the protein powder in it as well, it's like, well, that helps you rehydrate from the session as well.
Yeah.
'Cause those are my big things after I have a training session is I want to drink, I want to eat, and I want to sleep. So although protein is undeniably the most important nutrient for muscle building, some nutrient timing proponents have claimed that immediate post-workout carbohydrate consumption enhances anabolism. This is based on the premise that a post-exercise spike in nutrient-mediated insulin levels expedites glycogen resynthesis and also has the potential to augment the muscle protein synthesis response by inhibiting protein breakdown. However, Greenhalgh and colleagues observed a plateau in net protein synthesis at high insulin concentrations during the sustained elevation of amino acid availability. This degree of insulinemia is 3 to 4 times that of normal fasting levels and is easily achieved with a typical mixed meal. As Chris was saying, food is king. Using a 45 gram of whey protein alone, Power and colleagues saw a 5-fold rise in insulin beyond fasting concentrations. Importantly, the proposed necessity of post-exercise carbohydrate for optimizing the anabolic response has been challenged by a consistent replication of negative findings. Several acute studies have compared the effect of a robust protein dose of 20 to 25 grams versus the co-ingestion of protein and carbohydrate, and all of them have failed to see the additional carbohydrate augment net muscle protein accretion. Corroborating these acute findings, a 12-week trial by Holme and colleagues found no difference in muscle size and strength gains via post-exercise protein alone of 30 grams of whey compared to co-ingestion with carbohydrate, 34.5 grams of maltodextrin.
So what were your thoughts there, Jared, after reading that?
Well, the big one I always struggle with the insulin spike hypotheses that people put forward is generally it's not very good to spike your insulin. Like we try and spike the insulin to tell these nutrients to get into the cells, but you do have to recognize that a lot of the developed world disability is due to spiking insulin.
Yes.
And in general, it's not a very healthy thing to do.
Yeah.
And actually, I've known a lot of people who, well, maybe not a lot of people, but I can think of a handful of people that I know that are extremely healthy, train a lot and whatnot, and yet they have some issues with their fasting glucose because they do a lot of resistance training. They're big guys. They eat a lot. They've done a lot of spiking up their insulin with big simple carbohydrate and protein meals around exercise. And I mean, like a lot of these guys are also doing, 60 grams of maltodextrin in a session, which is probably excessive.
Mm.
But just because you're doing resistance training, you're doing sports nutrition around your resistance training. Sports nutrition isn't, higher on the hierarchy of just being basically healthy.
Yeah, that's right. I think when you take all the current evidence, it starts to be clear that if there's any effect on protein timing, it's pretty small. When we go back into just typical research, it's that the consumption of around 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day is needed to optimize the results. And that also that this window of opportunity is probably not as narrow as first thought it was. So rather that this window exists on a fairly wide continuum, and its effects on muscle growth ultimately depend on when the nutrients were consumed prior to the training bout. And rather also, as we've indicated a few times, the anabolic effects of an individual mixed meal last up to 6 hours. Once again, food is king. So therefore, provided that such a meal is consumed within about 3 to 4 hours prior to a workout, or possibly even longer, depending on the size of the meal, the need for immediate post-exercise nutrient consumption is possibly not needed as much. So for those who train partially, fully fasted, on the other hand, consuming protein immediately post-workout becomes increasingly more important to elicit anabolism. That makes pretty clear sense. If you haven't eaten a lot, you exercise, you need to fuel the body. But if one's training program goal is to maximize muscle growth, it seems obvious to consume a high-quality protein at a dose of approximately 0.4 to 0.5 grams per kilo of lean body mass, both pre-exercise and post-exercise, within about 4 to 6 hours of each other, depending on the meal size. And I'm just going to go back to the practicality of it. If we go on to the extreme and you're a 120, 130 kilo athlete, I think these windows of change a little bit. You need to be fueling that body quite often, especially if you're not naturally a big person. You have to work quite hard at that. So just in closing, what were your key points and takeaways from this, Jared?
Yeah, so just 3 takeaways for the listeners. The first one is that consuming protein post-exercise is important for muscular adaptations, but this window of opportunity is not as narrow as a lot of people may have previously proposed, as muscles are sensitized to protein intake for at least 24 hours after a training bout. And, always adding my 2 cents after that is, actually, I reckon it's more than 24 hours, particularly if you're doing eccentric exercise. And if anything, you could be more sensitized at 48 hours than 24 hours because of the recovery and repair mechanisms that happen there. You could actually be the next day, and I find that quite a lot, is after a really big demanding session, I wake up the next morning and I'm extra hungry the next day. Second takeaway point, the immediacy for post-exercise protein consumption will depend on the timing of the pre-workout meal. The closer the proximity of the meal to the training bout, the less the need for immediate post-workout protein intake. If training fasted, expeditious refueling with high-quality protein is beneficial to enhance muscular adaptations. And what they mean by high-quality protein there is high biological quality proteins, such as milk proteins, whey, and egg proteins. Number 3, to maximize muscle hypertrophy, consume high-quality protein at a dose of approximately 0.4 to 0.5 grams per kilogram of lean body mass, both pre-exercise and post-exercise within the 4 to 6 hours of each other, depending on meal size.
Yeah, I totally agree. It probably makes me stress a little bit less about having to want to eat before and after, but I'm going to be honest with you, I love to eat, so I'm going to continue pushing my own window of anabolic opportunity.
Right, and I think most dietitians agree there's really a food first sort of approach to nutrition, including sports nutrition, that things like supplements, protein supplements, they're a matter of convenience, not a matter of better.
And sometimes also, in a supplement-driven world, we actually need to be cautious, especially with athletes, because they may attribute success on a sporting field to their supplement regime. So if you have a table full of supplements, taking this, and this, what happens if you're somewhere and you don't have it? That can become a stress on its own that negates any potential benefit from these supplements.
Excellent. That's an excellent final point there. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, listeners. This has been Snippit Sports Science, sponsored by EliteForm.com. Please visit our sponsor. Goodbye.